The morning Terrance Obi walked into the Caldwell Group's boardroom, with his 9-year-old daughter beside him, he already knew it was a mistake. Not bringing her, he'd had no choice about that. Josie's school had a professional development day. The neighbor who usually watched her had a doctor's appointment, and the meeting had been moved up 48 hours without warning. He'd packed her a backpack with her sketchbook and a container of grapes, and told her to sit quietly in the chair by the window. She'd nodded seriously, the way she always did when she understood something was important. What was a mistake was thinking it wouldn't matter. Terrance Obi, 44 years old, had spent 17 years as a logistics coordinator for mid-sized manufacturing companies across southern Ontario. He was not flashy. He wore the same 3-button blazer he'd owned since his wife's cousin's wedding, and he kept his proposals in a blue binder that had a coffee ring on the cover. He knew how warehouses breathed, where the inefficiencies hid, how a poorly routed delivery chain could cost a company $300,000 a year without anyone noticing. He'd saved the Harwick metal plant in Brantford from insolvency by redesigning their inbound freight schedule in 2019. He had not taken credit for it publicly. That was not how he operated. The Caldwell Group was different from anything he'd worked with before. It had been founded 10 years earlier by a woman named Sable Duchesne, 41, who had grown up in Vancouver and come east to build what she described in interviews as a logistics ecosystem for the modern supply chain. The company had grown quickly. It was sleek and well-funded, and had an office that smelled like a spa. There were 2 massive photographs on the lobby wall, drone shots of their distribution network, and a receptionist who asked Terrance if he'd like sparkling or still. He'd said tap was fine. Josie had said the same, then looked up at the receptionist and added please, and the woman had smiled at her in a way that felt almost like sympathy. The meeting was supposed to be about a contract renewal. Terrance had been brought in 8 months earlier to consult on their Southern Ontario corridor, a stretch of highway-dependent freight movement that was losing them money in ways their internal team hadn't been able to diagnose. He'd found it within 3 weeks. The problem was in the handoff protocol between their third-party carriers and their own warehouse intake staff. Simple, structural, expensive to ignore. He'd fixed it. The numbers since then had been unambiguous. Their Q3 loss on that corridor had been $214,000. By Q1 of the following year, it was a $40,000 gain. That was a $250,000 swing on a single process change. He sat down across from Sable Duchesne and 3 members of her senior team. His daughter sat by the window with her sketchbook open, already drawing something, her feet not quite reaching the floor. Sable looked at Josie once. Then she looked at Terrance. "I appreciate you making the time," she said. "We're going to keep this brief." Terrance opened his binder. Sable placed her hand flat on the table, not unkindly but firmly, as if she were stopping traffic. "We've made a decision to move our optimization work internally," she said. "We've brought on a director-level hire from a tech firm in Waterloo. She's building out a data team. They'll be using a proprietary algorithm to handle what you've been doing manually." Terrance looked at the binder, then he looked at her. "The work I've been doing hasn't been manual," he said. "It's been analytical. The algorithm is only as good as the logic behind it. The logic is what I built. We'll be using the framework you established as a starting point," said one of the other men at the table, a younger one, maybe 30, with the kind of confidence that came from never having had to be wrong about anything with consequences. Terrance noted this. He did not respond to it. "There's a severance figure in the package we've prepared," Sable said. 2 months. "The contract runs out at end of quarter anyway, so this just accelerates the timeline." From the window, Josie had stopped drawing. She was watching her father's face the way children do when they're trying to decide whether to be afraid. Terrance closed the binder. "The Montrose corridor is going to give you problems by August," he said. "The Waterloo algorithm won't account for the seasonal variance in cross-border clearance times. I've seen it happen at 3 other companies. It looks like efficiency until it isn't. No one wrote this down." "We'll flag it for the team," the young man said. Sable walked Terrance to the elevator herself, which he thought was either a gesture of respect or a way to ensure he actually left. Maybe both. "You're very good at what you do," she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it. "We just need a different kind of good now." The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. Josie took his hand. The doors closed. She looked up at him. "Are we fired, Dad?" "I'm fired," he said. "You were never employed." She thought about this. "Okay," she said then. "Can we get a sandwich?" They got a sandwich. He watched her eat half of it and tucked the other half in her backpack for later. The way she always did, a habit she'd developed on her own, somewhere around age 7, and that he'd never quite been able to trace back to anything he'd taught her. He drank his coffee and looked out the window at the parking lot and thought about the Montrose corridor. The story of how Terrance Obi came to own the Halverson property starts, technically, 6 weeks later, though it had been building for longer than that. He had moved to Hamilton 3 years earlier after his wife Claudine died of a brain aneurysm at 39. It had been sudden and total, and left him standing in the kitchen of their Mississauga house at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, with a daughter who was 6 years old, and a job he hadn't been able to look at for 2 months afterward. He'd sold the house. He'd moved somewhere smaller and cheaper. He'd kept working because Josie needed things: groceries, school fees, a winter coat, swimming lessons she'd begged for, and work was something he knew how to do. He rented a half-double on the east end of Hamilton, 2 blocks from a rail yard, on a street where most of the houses had been built in the 1950s for steelworkers and their families. The neighborhood had a community feel that Terrance found quietly sustaining. His neighbor, a retired woman named Vera Sabo, watched Josie after school for $40 a week and refused to take more. His other neighbor, a man named Eddie who drove for CN Rail, left a bag of zucchini from his garden on the porch every August and never mentioned it. After the Caldwell meeting, Terrance did not panic. He was not prone to panic. He recalculated. He had 7 months of savings. The contract payout would extend that. He had skills that were specific and provable. He would find another contract, but in the evenings, after Josie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and the kind of quiet that fills a house when there's only one adult in it, and he thought about what Sable had said. A different kind of good. He'd been in logistics for 17 years. He'd fixed problems for other people's companies. He'd built systems, and then he'd handed those systems to the companies, and the companies had kept the benefit of them, and he had moved on. There was nothing wrong with this as a model. It was just that it had a ceiling, and he was sitting under that ceiling, and it was low. Around this time, he started reading about the Halverson property. It had come up in a conversation with a man named Bryce Telfer, a commercial real estate agent he knew through a mutual contact. Bryce had mentioned it the way you mention things that aren't expected to go anywhere. A 1940s industrial building on the Stony Creek side of Hamilton. Roughly 18,000 square feet of warehouse space. A loading dock on the east side that needed structural repair, and a history of failed tenants stretching back 12 years. The previous owner, a small trucking operation, had left behind a scatter of broken pallets, 2 inoperable forklifts, and a lease dispute that had kept the property tied up in procedural limbo for 3 years. It had just cleared title. The asking price was $680,000. This was by any reasonable measure not something Terrance could afford. His savings were about $90,000. His credit was solid, but not spectacular. He was a single father in a rented half-double, with a semi-reliable 2014 pickup truck and a blue binder with a coffee ring on the cover. He drove out to look at it anyway. The building sat back from the road behind a chain-link fence, with a lock that had been cut and replaced with a padlock so old it didn't even have a brand name on it. He stood in the lot for a long time. The loading dock faced south. The roof had a visible sag over the northwest corner, but the rest of the structure looked solid. The loading bay doors, there were 3 of them, were intact. The floor inside, what he could see through the dirty window by the entrance, was poured concrete, cracked in places but level. He stood there and ran numbers in his head the way another person might hum a song. The The sag in the roof was a problem, but it was a bounded problem. The loading dock repair was expensive but not catastrophic. The floor was workable. The location, 6 minutes from the Red Hill Expressway, 8 from the QEW, with CN spur access through a connector 2 streets overs, was not incidental. It was the thing, it was the entire thing. He thought about what he'd told Sable Duchesne. The algorithm is only as good as the logic behind it. He went home. He put Josie to bed. He sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Then he called Bryce. The financing took 3 months and required levels of creativity that Terrance had not previously associated with spreadsheets. His brother-in-law, a man named Graham Dix, who ran an equipment rental company outside London, Ontario, agreed to come in for $75,000 in exchange for a small ownership stake and storage rights for 4 of his vehicles. A former colleague, a woman named Pat Acheby, who'd left the logistics industry to run a micro-investment group, brought in $50,000 after reading the business plan. Terrance had spent 6 evenings writing at the kitchen table. The bank, after reviewing the projections and the location data, offered a commercial mortgage for the balance at a rate that made Terrance exhale very slowly. He closed on the Halverson building on a cold Thursday in October. He brought Josie because Vera was at her daughter's in Burlington, and there was no one else. She sat on the tailgate of the pickup truck in the parking lot with her sketchbook while he walked the building with the inspector. When he came back out, she showed him what she'd drawn, a rough approximation of the building with a small flag on the roof. "What's the flag?" he asked. She shrugged. "I didn't know what to put on it," she said. "You can decide." He taped the drawing to the wall of the office space inside the building, above the table where he set up his laptop. It stayed there. The work was not quick, and it was not easy, and that was the point. Terrance did not have the money to hire a full renovation crew, so the first 4 months were staged. Structural priority first, then systems, then operational setup. He hired 2 retired tradespeople from the neighborhood through a word-of-mouth connection Eddie from next door had given him. A man named Jack, who'd spent 30 years as a commercial roofer, and his friend Brian, who'd been in industrial electrical. They charged fair rates and worked without drama, and told him when something was worse than expected and when something was better. The roof sag, it turned out, was a rafter issue, not a sheeting issue, more manageable, more expensive, but more manageable. He did the non-technical work himself. On weekends, while Josie sat in the office doing homework or drawing, he cleared the debris from the warehouse floor. He disassembled the broken pallets and stacked the wood in a pile by the east door. He hauled out the 2 inoperable forklifts with a rented tow vehicle. He patched concrete. He cleaned windows. Josie, by February, had started calling the building the warehouse, with the same tone she used for the car and the house, as if it were simply part of the geography of their life, which, Terrance supposed it was. She also started asking questions about it. "How much stuff can it hold?" she asked one Saturday, sitting on a sawhorse eating an apple. "About 4,000 pallet positions when it's racked," he said. "What's a pallet position?" he explained. She listened the way she listened to everything, with full attention, her head slightly tilted, not interrupting until he finished. "So it's like parking spaces," she said. "But for boxes." "Exactly like that," he said. "You should put it that way on the website," she said, and went back to her apple. He put it on the website. The first client was a small food distributor out of Burlington called Thornbury Fine Foods, run by a woman named Asha Kanapan, who needed temperature-stable dry goods storage and had been priced out of every option within 40 kilometers of the city. She came to see the building in March, walked through it with Terrance for about an hour, and signed a 12-month agreement before she left. The second client came through Graham's network, a home goods importer who needed overflow space during container season and couldn't commit to a full lease, but would pay per pallet on a rotating basis. This was exactly the flexible capacity model Terrance had built the pricing structure around. The third client was an e-commerce operation run by 2 brothers from Stony Creek, who'd been operating out of their parents' garage and needed to scale. They signed for 800 square feet of dedicated space, and brought their own shelving. By May, 8 months after closing, the building was running at roughly 60% capacity. It was not profitable yet, the debt service was substantial, and the operating costs were real. But the trajectory was visible and linear, and Terrance had spent enough years reading financial projections to know the difference between a line that was going somewhere and a line that wasn't. He allowed himself once, in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, with a cup of tea and the quiet of the house, to feel something that was adjacent to certainty. He wasn't looking for Sable Duchesne's attention. He was, in fact, not thinking about the Caldwell Group at all. But in June, the story found him anyway. A supply chain trade publication, a regional one, the kind that ran profiles on logistics companies across Ontario and Quebec, contacted him about a feature. The hook was the building itself, an abandoned industrial site converted to a functioning third-party logistics hub in under a year, operated by a former consultant. The writer had found him through Asha Kanapan, who'd mentioned the space in an unrelated interview. Terrance agreed to the piece with some reluctance. He was not accustomed to this kind of exposure, and found the idea of being written about faintly uncomfortable. But Asha had encouraged it, and Graham had told him flatly that he needed to stop being invisible, and so he agreed. The article ran in late June. It was not sensational. It described the building, the business model, the numbers. It quoted Terrance once, on the subject of flexible capacity logistics as a structural solution for mid-sized businesses being squeezed by the major 3PL providers. It mentioned, in passing, that his operation was already taking market share in the Greater Hamilton area from larger competitors. He saw the traffic on the website the week the article came out. Then he saw the email. It was from an address at the Caldwell Group. The subject line read, "Proposed Partnership Conversation." He read it twice. Then he made himself a cup of tea and read it a third time. The email was from Sable Duchesne herself. It was professional and measured and made no reference to the earlier meeting. It noted that the Caldwell Group was exploring partnership arrangements with regional logistics providers, and wondered whether he'd be open to a conversation. He thought about August. He thought about the Montrose corridor. He thought about the young man at the boardroom table, who had written nothing down. He looked at his calendar. He thought about what he wanted to say, and what he wanted the response to say about him, and whether those were the same thing. Then he wrote back, "Thank you for reaching out. I'm open to a conversation. I'd suggest you pull your Montrose corridor numbers before we meet. I think you'll find the discussion more useful if you do." He sent it. He closed the laptop. From the hallway he could hear Josie's white noise machine through her bedroom door. She'd slept with it since she was 3. A sound like didn't rain, and the house was otherwise completely quiet. They met at the end of July. Sable came to the warehouse. This had been Terrance's condition, not stated as a condition but offered as the location, and she had accepted. She brought one person, a woman from her operations team named Dara, who had the look of someone who had read the trade article more than once. Terrance gave them the tour himself. He didn't dress it up. He showed them the racked storage, the loading dock, the intake staging area, the small temperature-controlled zone he'd built out on the east wall for Thornbury. He showed them the capacity utilization chart on the wall beside the office, a simple printout, updated weekly, taped next to Josie's drawing of the building with the empty flag. Dara asked good questions. Sable asked fewer, but better. They sat down at the table in the office. Terrance opened a folder. Not a blue binder this time, a plain manila one. But the coffee ring on the edge was from the same mug, and walked them through the Montrose numbers. He had been right about August. The Waterloo algorithm had failed to account for the seasonal pattern in U.S. Customs pre-clearance processing times for temperature-sensitive goods. The Caldwell Group had lost 11 days of delivery windows across 17 clients. 3 clients had issued formal complaints. 1 had already given notice. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. The numbers said it, and numbers don't gloat. What he said was, "This is a solvable problem. Here's how I'd solve it." He walked them through a hybrid model, a combination of algorithm-guided routing, with human variance monitoring at the decision points where seasonal or regulatory patterns created predictable anomalies. It was not complicated. It was the kind of solution that looked obvious after the fact and required 17 years of watching things fail before the fact. Sable listened. She didn't place her hand on the table to stop him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What would a partnership look like to you?" she said. "It would look like a contract with the warehouse," he said. "Not a consulting arrangement. A freight-in and distribution agreement. You route your Hamilton and Niagara corridor clients through here. I handle intake, staging, and carrier coordination. You keep the client relationship. And the data work? I consult on the variance monitoring. That's separate. That's billed separately." Dara was writing things down. Sable looked at the drawing on the wall, the building with the empty flag. She looked at it for a moment longer than Terrance had expected. "My daughter drew that," he said, "the day we closed on the building." Sable looked at him. "What's she going to put on the flag?" "She said I could decide," he said. Sable nodded slowly. "Then you'd better figure out what you're flying," she said. The contract with the Caldwell Group was signed in September. It was not the only one. The trade article had continued to generate inquiries, and by fall, Terrance had brought in 2 more long-term clients: a pharmaceutical packaging company that needed bonded storage, and a regional grocery chain running a just-in-time model that required flexible staging space. The building was at 88% capacity. He'd hired 2 full-time staff, a warehouse associate named Marcus who'd been driving forklift at a nearby facility and looking for something more stable, and a part-time operations coordinator named Lee, who worked mornings and had a mind for scheduling that Terrance recognized immediately as better than his own in certain respects. He didn't tell Lee this out loud. He adjusted responsibilities accordingly, which was the same thing. Pat Achibi called when the September numbers came through. "Terrance," she said, "this is not where I expected to be in this conversation." "Where did you expect to be?" he said. "Worried," she said. "I'm not worried." Graham Dix drove up from London on a Friday in October and stood in the middle of the warehouse floor, with his hands in his jacket pockets, turning slowly, taking it in. "I thought you were nuts," he said. "Not the business plan. The first time you told me, I thought you were nuts." "I know," Terrance said. "I'm glad I was wrong," Graham said. "I know that too," Terrance said. They drove to a place on Barton Street for lunch and argued about hockey and split the bill down the middle. And it was a completely ordinary thing in a life that Terrance had rebuilt from the kind of quiet wreckage that doesn't show from the outside. Josie turned 10 in November. She asked for a birthday party at the warehouse, which Terrance had not expected. He'd expected a request involving laser tag or a bowling alley or the trampoline park her Zara was always talking about. "Why the warehouse?" he asked. She considered this seriously. "Because it's ours," she said. "They had the party on a Saturday." He moved some of the stored inventory to clear the west end of the floor and strung lights that Vera Sabo had lent him from her Christmas storage. 8 children ran around on the concrete floor and climbed, carefully and with supervision, on the lower rack levels, and Asha Kanapan came with her family and brought a cake from a Punjabi bakery in Burlington that was better than anything Terrance could have found on his own. Graham was there with his wife. Marcus came with his daughter. Eddie from the neighborhood showed up at the end with a bag of late-season squash and stood eating cake near the loading dock, nodding at the building in a way that conveyed something like approval. Terrance stood back and watched it all. He was not a man who catalogued moments. He didn't photograph things habitually or narrate his own life to himself in real time. But there are moments that take up permanent space in a person without requiring any formal installation. And this was one of them. The lights, the noise, his daughter running across the concrete floor of a building that had been abandoned when he found it, the flag on her drawing still empty because he hadn't decided yet, and himself standing at the edge of all of it, watching it exist. At the end of the evening, after the other families had gone, and Marcus had helped him fold the rented tables, and Josie was sitting on the tailgate of the truck half asleep in her coat, she said, "Dad." "Yeah," he said. I know what goes on the flag. He looked at her. Her eyes were almost closed. What? He said. Our name, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, yeah, I think you're right. She was asleep before they got home. He drove through the east end of Hamilton, in the November dark, the city quiet around him. The rail yard lit up, on the left side of the road, the old streets and the old houses. And beside him his daughter breathing slowly in the passenger seat. The flag on the building would read OB Logistics by the following spring. Sable Duchesne's team would begin routing their Hamilton corridor through it that same month. And in the industry directory, where Terrance updated his profile in January, in the field that asked for company description, he wrote 4 words, took them out, wrote them again, and left them. We know how this works.